Welcome to Doc NYC and the special Q&A for Belushi. I'm Tom Powers, the festival's artistic director. I'm pleased to have with me the film's director, RJ Cutler, who's joining me from Los Angeles. RJ, let me start by asking, what did John Belushi mean to you before you took on this project?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for showing the film. We're truly honored to be a part of Doc NYC. I was a kid who had two magazine subscriptions. One was to Sports Illustrated, and the other was to National Lampoon. And I followed my sports teams through Sports Illustrated, but I developed my worldview through the Lampoon. And the Lampoon led me to the Lampoon Radio Hour, where I became familiar with hearing John Belushi's name in the credits, and though I didn't know more specifically, with his work. And then when I just found him at age 14, 15 as a original member of Not Ready for Primetime Players, I was hooked. And probably if I hadn't been familiar with him before then, I would have been hooked, because John had this unique ability not only to compel you as a performer who kind of blew your mind, but he drew you into who he was as a person, in that way that true stars can, and so he meant that much to me, and then more.
So how did you get connected with this project?
Well, the very awesome John Batzik, with whom I had produced Listen to Me, Marlon, and I were having lunch one day talking about what we might do next. We knew that it would be something for me to direct, and we were kicking around ideas. And he mentioned that he was in the midst of what had become a decade-long pursuit of the rights to make a film about John Belushi. He had been wooing Judy Belushi, who had every 6 months or so kindly turned him away. Once she had turned him away by encouraging him to have lunch with Jim Belushi, fairly certain that would end his pursuit. And from what I understand, Jim did his best to end John's pursuit during that lunch. I'm not even sure they got through the meal. But John stayed at it, and after he and I decided that it would be worth taking another approach, he sent Judy Listen to Me, Marlon, and she responded to it, and as we say, it's all in the timing, and in this case the timing was right, because it worked out in terms of where Judy was in her life and where we were, and the film we shared with her, and she decided to meet with us and invited us up to the Vineyard, and we spent some time together, which is where she also first gave us the opportunity to look through John's archive, which was in the basement of her house in the Vineyard, and it was there that we discovered so much that became central to the film. The letters that he wrote to her, which she had kept, they had a correspondence through their lives together from the time they met as teenagers until John's death. And so we came to life before our very eyes. And then also we discovered another box of tapes, as we had with Listen to Me, Marlon, in this case, tapes of an oral history that Judy had overseen for quite some time, but which began in the years following John's death. And between those tapes and the letters, we knew there was a film that could be made that would be a unique telling of John's story.
You mentioned Listen to Me, Marlon, a couple times. For anyone who doesn't know that film, it's a film about Marlon Brando that draws upon tapes of his that had never been heard before. So let me ask you about that archive, because I know when I approached this film, my initial thought was, well, how much more could there be to know about John Belushi? He had a short life. There's been a lot of coverage of it. There's been, every 5 years, Saturday Night Live honors itself again with some anniversary. But one of the delights and revelations of this film is there is so much stuff that I had never seen before.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and of course, there's a generation or two of potential fans who are familiar with old with low def reruns of Saturday Night Live, but not necessarily with the man himself. But in terms of the archive, what was exciting was that. I had kind of, around the period I was describing before, I had started to talk to people about John, people who had shared their lives with him, and what I was finding was generally that the stories they would tell me, there were two things going on. One was that they felt a little lost in the foggy haze of memory. There was a nostalgia. There was not an immediacy, not a rawness to them. And the other thing was they felt a little ossified. These are the stories I tell when I talk about John Belushi. It had been decades, and it makes sense. It's only human after all. And your memories become distant, and you tell your favorite tales. But it wasn't. I was concerned, and I was concerned that because I knew that a film about John Belushi had to be immediate. I knew that it had to be raw. I knew that it had to capture what it was like to be alive with him. That was the important thing, not what it was like to remember a life that lived too short. And sure enough, in this box of audio tapes that Judy had overseen and conducted some of the interviews. Tanner Colby had done the others. In this box of tapes was immediate memories, immediate recollections, the rawness, and also, of course, there were the voices of people who were no longer with us: Carrie Fisher, Harold Ramis, others. And so, what they allowed me to do was make a film as though I were making a film, and had access to all of John's nearest and dearest in the months, years following his death, rather than 3-4 decades hence. And that made all the difference in the world. And then, of course, as well, the letters, which bring you into his heart, which Bill Hader reads with such, kind of stunning clarity, summoning John without performing him. And which are brought to life so beautifully by Stefan Nadelman, who did the graphics for the film.
So you talked about Judy Belushi and Jim Belushi having apprehensions for years, and perhaps a defensiveness around trying to avoid a John Belushi documentary. Can you, give insight into what you think their apprehensions were?
Well, yes. I mean, my understanding is that in the wake of John's death, they had entrusted Bob Woodward to write the book that became Wired, and they felt, and they of course would have to speak for themselves, but they felt they were disappointed in the results. They felt as though there was a discrepancy between what they had been told the book would be about and what the book was about. That the book focused on the sensational aspects of his addiction and of his life and of his death, rather than the artistry. And in fact, that is what inspired Judy to set out to do this oral history. What if we do talk about the artist, the man, and you can't talk about John. It's not possible, as is said in the film, to talk about John without talking about his addiction, without talking about his appetites, without talking about his excesses, and without talking about the hole that seemed he yearned to fill and seemed incapable to fill. These are things that define who he is, and were part of his part and parcel of who he was with his genius. And so all of those things are, of course, discussed, but there's so much more. And again, our focus, my desire was to focus not on the death, not on what it was like for him to die, but on what it was like for him to live. And I think that is what the difference was from what they feared, and as opposed to what we were proposing.
The letters that we hear read, had those ever been available to another biographer before?
Not that I'm aware of. I'd never seen them before, and we hadn't come across them in other ways. These were very personal letters written, love letters written from teenagers in love, and through the end of his life. Judy shared with us her diary entries. This was a unique kind of access. You know, it's interesting to have verite aspirations for an archival film. Of course, Stephen Riley taught us again with Listen to Me, Marlon, and that it's possible to be both archival and completely immediate and present, as though, you know, in the subject's head. And we shared those aspirations in this film. So those letters really brought us in. Also, you know, John lived during a time where there was no social media, and he was an intensely private man. And he didn't do a lot of interviews. He didn't trust the press. When he was interviewed, he tended to be performative. So how do you get to the guy? And the letters were quite an avenue in.
So what was the experience like to share the finished film with Judy Belushi?
Well, that's always a very rich and meaningful part of the process. My first film was I produced War Room, and learned so much from D.A. Pennebaker and Chris Hedges, the directors, about how one does all this. And one of the things that they taught me was to don't ever forget who the story belongs to, and that's the subject. And they'll loan it to you. They'll let you tell it. It's your film. They'll let you tell it, but you don't forget. And one of the manifestations of that is that you always go to the subject and you share the film with them. You share it with them before you shared it with anybody else, and you share it with them while you're still in process, so that you can, because that conversation has to be open and it has to be honest. So I've had some, you know, I adhere to the lessons that Penny and Chris taught me as much as possible, and I've had some adventures sharing movies. I made a movie about Dick Cheney, and it ended up in a cabin in Wyoming with the Cheney family, looking at an almost finished cut. So and lived to tell the tale. This was very rich and meaningful, and Judy was very loving, and it's not an easy story for someone who shared a life with John to sit through, but it was very meaningful to her, and she watched it a number of times over a period of time, and has been incredibly loving and supportive.
Well, we're so pleased at Doc NYC to be able to preview this film. I want to let audiences know it's going to come to Showtime on November 22nd. So please spread the word when Belushi is available to a wider audience. RJ Cutler, thank you very much for your film and for being here with us today.
Always a pleasure, Tom. Thank you again.